Right, so hello everyone, and welcome to How Digital Assessment Can Help Revolutionise Online and Blended Learning. This is a Times Higher Education webinar in partnership with Inspera. My name is Alistair Lawrence. I'm the Special Projects Editor at THE, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. So I'm joined by a panel of experts from academia and industry today, who are Giselle Barnes, who is Provost at Massey University, Bridget Cool, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor of Education at the University of Auckland, Ishak Hatta, who is General Manager for Australia and New Zealand at Inspera Assessment, Dominic Parish, who's Pro-Vice Chancellor for Learning and Teaching at Macquarie University, Jenny Shaw, who is Deputy Vice Chancellor and Vice President Academic at the University of Adelaide, and Sherman Young, who is Deputy Vice Chancellor of Education and Vice President at RMIT. There will be an opportunity to put questions to the panel during the final 5 or 10 minutes of the hour that we have scheduled today. So please feel free to write any questions that you have in the Zoom box, and we will try to answer as many as possible before the end. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only completely changed how institutions deliver teaching to their students, but also rewritten the traditional rules of assessment and examinations. With some of the strictest lockdown restrictions worldwide, both Australia and New Zealand must consider how digital teaching and assessment can keep their universities among the global players in the world of higher education. So today we're going to try and share knowledge and discuss best practice about how to do that. I would like to start by asking the panel, how can the innovation and improvements enabled by digital assessment be retained as universities move towards blended learning? Basically, has people started to think already about the proverbial what to get rid of and what to keep when they start planning for the years ahead? Jenny, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thanks, Alistair. Look, we're discussing that question right now. There've not been many upsides to this pandemic, as you know, but one of the few is that academic staff realised individually and collectively that we could pivot online quickly, and that our students and colleagues, for the most part, were able to adjust quickly, and that in fact digital assessment suited some staff and students better than traditional assessment modes and formats. So I teach at a university that prides itself on its on-campus experience, and we're aiming to return to that as soon as possible. But there are some areas, including some areas pre-pandemic, that insisted that all assessment be face-to-face, that are now insisting that they will never return to face-to-face assessment, and that digital assessment is here to stay. So if we're to do that, and we will in some areas, we'll need significant investment in our online systems and ongoing training and support for our staff and students. And I know you want to touch on that later. So we're looking at these issues right now.
Okay, and you mentioned that for some students and staff it's been particularly beneficial. Are there particular cohorts or particular disciplines that you've found have been helped the most by the move to online?
Well, actually, the two cohorts that have really embraced online, to our great surprise, because they were very much anti-online before, are maths and medicine. So with the mathematicians, again, there is still a tendency to say you must examine, and you must examine with handwritten examination papers, so that the students filling them by hand. But actually you can still do that in a digital environment. So I think they've come to terms with that very well. And in fact, we're having to have conversations with them about doing more on campus than they would like to do now. With medicine, I think they pivoted to a system where, again, it used to be a very much an interrogation of individual students with panels of clinical specialists. And they've actually decided that the online format does work very well for them. It's a different kind of learning and teaching and assessment, but it looks like we will actually keep quite a lot of the medical assessment online. It also means that we are treating our students out on rural placements very fairly, because everyone's getting the same kind of assessment, whether it's on our campuses in cities or in rural areas where they might be one of just a handful of students at that particular facility. So it's been really interesting.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jenny. I was wondering if the other panelists can tell us perhaps about the biggest challenges they've encountered when they're deciding, what to keep and what to change going forward. Sherman, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer your question, Alistair. I just want to throw in another dimension to it. I think one of the things out of COVID is that it's pretty clear that the world we're going to enter into is not going to be the same as the world that we left. And that's not just in education, that's across the world of work and the world of life. And we're going to be increasingly engaged with digital formats in everything we do, whether we like it or not. So one of the key drivers for me is that as we think about what our graduates and their careers look like, they're going to have to be properly equipped to engage in a different way with their world of work. A lot of that's going to be hybrid, a lot of that's going to be digital. So we need to make sure that the skills that they have and the way we assess those skills is appropriate for this future. So one of the drivers will be, okay, how can we make sure that we assess into a future that we know is going to be different from the past, and that clearly is going to have to be, to a certain extent, digital, and continue to engage with those that sort of thinking. So I thought I'd just add that thought.
Sure, thank you, Sherman. Giselle, we come to you next, please, and then Bridget after that.
Kia ora, thank you for the opportunity to comment on this. So I agree with Sherman's observations around the fact that we have transitioned into another space, and indeed this means that the role of universities is changing. And so, you know, as I think we're all coming to terms with, universities are no longer just repositories of information. We are now curators of knowledge that is ubiquitous and out there, and we are part of a digital environment. One of the challenges I think that we face, and particularly in assessment, is that we are operating in a non-linear world, and yet with the accreditation of linear modes of learning that culminate in a degree, we are principally still thinking in linear terms. And so I think there's a real challenge that's coming from students, particularly around how we can disrupt that. Just a comment about Massey University's experience. We've been an online and digital provider for about 50 years. Our online capability has developed just in recent years, pre the pandemic. We also went through that experience of the great pivot to online, thanks to the Herculean efforts of our staff across the university. And so we are now in a space where we are supporting a blended approach and supporting our staff to ensure that we're developing really high quality, well-designed assessment for online. So we're trying to steer away from what Sally Kift has appropriately called panic-gogy, you know, just turn on the Zoom camera or turn on the camera to an in-class lecture. Actually, we need to rethink about, you know, how we redesign for the online platform, and that applies to assessment as well. So I think there's a huge amount of work that is required in terms of supporting academic staff with that innovation and that particular development. Kia ora.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned about moving away from assessment in linear terms. Is that about sort of changing the modularity of assessment, the forms of assessment? I mean, is kind of everything on the table still at this point?
I think it should be, Alistair. I think we should be looking at increasingly authentic assessment and what that looks like for students in really preparing them for the world of work. So at our university, we've seen an increasing move away from summative forms of assessment like traditional examinations, for example. We are still in conversation with a number of our professional bodies because they do see exams as the gold standard of learning and of assessment. But the world is changing, and it will change again. So I think we've got to be very open to dynamic forms of authentic assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. Bridget, please let us know your thoughts.
Thanks, Alistair. So picking up on some of the commentary that's gone before, yes, you know, similarly we've had to shift. I think we had a 1 week no teaching time for us to flip on to emergency remote delivery. So a lot of support for staff, and I think education in relation that, you know, remote delivery is not the same as online delivery. They're different, completely different pedagogical approach. So I think the support that's required for staff to upskill to be able to do that that delivery has been immense, and a huge part of that has been assessment design. So I think we've done that. I think, and COVID's brought the future forward, and what we're wanting staff to think about has had to happen. So, and some of that has been around academic integrity issues. So traditional exams that may in some disciplines have just really been a recall of fact. We're, you know, challenging them to consider higher assessing higher order thinking skills and levels of knowledge, which means that we need to design our assessments differently. So that's, I think, been a really exciting shift, that we've had lots of workshops, lots of support, and lots of exemplars and staff saying, actually, that was a far better assessment. I think because, it's easy to roll out the same assessment, but really people are having to really think about what they're doing. So that's been a fantastic gain, I think, for us, and still a lot to do. And I think really acknowledging the effort that requires on staff's part. It is a huge amount of effort to completely rethink an assessment, acknowledging that workload, recognising and supporting those efforts that are required. To Jenny's point, redisciplines, which disciplines perhaps required more of a shift than others, and those of our disciplines that have practicum requirements and are used to assessing in that way, it was definitely challenging, but again, some fantastic creativity coming out. And for example, our OSCEs, which similar to Jenny, are the way our medical students, they're clinical, we've had really creative ways of doing those via Zoom, with an actor on one Zoom call and the assessors on another, and the student in the other. So we have managed to create some great opportunities. Lab space has been pretty challenging. So those courses that are lab based, who ordinarily have a lab assessments, but again, some creativity happening there, which has been really encouraging. And I think from an assessment point of view and being online, what it's meant is for our equity students, it's actually in some ways increased their accessibility. Before, they had to travel into the campus to sit an exam, which it's an opportunity time, it's costs of getting there where they can do those assessments from somewhere that suits them. But of course, then there's the flip side of students having to sit assessments and perhaps not desirable settings. They don't have the luxury of a space that's quiet where they can do that, or they don't have good Wi-Fi, etc. So it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword. And also to Giselle's point, we've also been re-looking at the weighting of exams. So we only have a requirement in our first year undergraduate courses that it used to be that 50% of assessments are invigilated, and we've now removed that requirement. So again, that's a shift, but again, pushback from accrediting bodies for our professional programs. So it's kind of navigating that space as well.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. I mean, to the earlier point you made about how you're actually giving staff the room to sort of learn about these things and ask questions and to implement them. Obviously, you're mindful of not wanting to overburden your staff, but is it a case of striking a balance between creating a structure where staff can come in and learn about new approaches, but also trying to give them the room to innovate? So you take almost a sort of a bottom-up approach in some disciplines.
That's right, and I think it's supporting that in a number of ways. So we've sort of introduced a new structure with our sort of central learning designers. So faculties can approach those learning designers with projects, and that project maybe, can you help me redesign this assessment? But the whole idea of the learning designers, that it's a sort of train the trainer, so they then develop those skills so they can support other people in their staffing teams. And we also have other positions within faculties who are there to support that growth, and also looking at ways that we can support innovation through we have some grants, for example, fairly low value grants, but they do allow staff to have some resource to help them with creatively look at new innovations. But yeah, it's creating the time, giving them support, I think acknowledging it in our recognition framework, so our academic performance standards, so that we really do value staff being able to think creatively, and we acknowledge that. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach.
And were the learning designers in place pre-pandemic? Is this something that's been scaled to a larger team over the past couple of years?
We had some faculties, I think we had 3 faculties that had chosen to have sort of learning design or learning teaching units embedded within their faculties. And it became evident that those faculties had chosen to support that, financially. And then there was realizing that other faculties, for whatever reasons, did not have that in place. So then we centralized it. So there's now a central a unit that looks after learning design. But as I say, then faculties can apply for projects. So we have a teaching and learning initiative round where they can put forward their projects that align with the strategic direction of the university and for that faculty as well as this ad hoc opportunities when things come up. We might change policies or the government might change something we have to do. So bit of a mix.
Okay, great, thank you. Giselle, do you have something you'd like to add about that?
Yes, I did. Thanks, Alistair. I mean, here at my university, we have a similar kind of approach. We have a highly centralised team of experts in whom we started investing and growing pre-pandemic. And they effectively work with academics in partnership across the university. So the academic owns the direction of travel in terms of the content, but we've curriculum designers, developers, teaching experts who are there to help refresh and think about the reframing of the content and also the redesign of the assessment that sits alongside that. It's really important that staff have time to do that. So time is bought out of that. It's not just an add-on to what they do, because we have to remember that staff come into the university and take on careers as academics because they're passionate about their research, they love their teaching, and so we need to put that at elbow support next to them. We've found at AUSD, Alistair, that staff have really leaned into this, but it is challenging to engage. And conversely, our students, we are finding, many of whom are digital natives, are really comfortable with digital assessment and so on and so forth. And something that we might touch on later in the conversation is the way in which, through the primary and the secondary education systems in our respective jurisdiction, I suspect that digital assessment is becoming the norm. And so that is creating a sense of expectation amongst school leavers coming into the university sector as well.
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. We're normally good for about 1 hour. Sherman, please, can you go next? And then Dominic, I've got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Giselle said. I totally agree that the students are absolutely engaged with the digital learning full stop and also digital assessment, except for one area where, and we try not to do this, but I think there was a question in the chat around accredited bodies. We still allow some invigilated exams for accredited reasons. And the students are very uncomfortable with proctored online exams. Which is why we've made the decision at RMIT to only use that as the absolute last resort, where an accrediting body has demanded it of us. And of course, we do have to have that dance with the accredited body over time, but sometimes you can't get that done. And so the invigilated exam becomes an online proctored exam. It's something that our students have made very clear they're not comfortable with, partly because of privacy reasons, partly because of technology reasons, partly because of accessibility reasons. I share that concern, and that's one area that I'm very keen to think of alternative, more authentic, as this group seems to be heading towards more authentic approaches, and a shift away from that kind of invigilated approach is something that we're very passionate about as well.
Okay, great, thanks. Ishan, I might come to you to ask you a couple of questions about what you see as the future for that particular format, because it does remain necessary for some forms of assessment. Dominic, can you perhaps tell us a little bit about the move towards authentic assessment at Macquarie and how that's being managed, and what you think has been going well and what challenges persist, maybe?
So look, I think for us, authentic assessment has taken on it's been respected, whereas previously, the pandemic allowed us the opportunity to retrain the thinking of our staff, but also our students, which is much the same as what others have said. That thinking about, the only form of assessment is the summative exam has really been shifted. And now we're thinking about other ways of doing those sorts of assessments. And the authentic has come into things like getting students to explain. So we've done oral vivas quite a bit. We've looked more at project work. We have been very conscious of academic integrity across this last 2 years, particularly the incidence of academic integrity we perceive has risen. Now, we don't know if that's because we've actually been able to detect it more, given what we're engaging in with respect to our assessments, but that has been a real issue for us. And so we are looking at things like projects and, work integrated type tasks where students are doing a lot more reflection and a lot more, reliance on the workplace and how that learning that they're engaging in has actually or could actually manifest into a workplace. We've really taken a bit more of a real world view in terms of that employability lens that we've tried to apply.
We're going to talk a little bit about the international offering later on if we have time, hopefully. But do you think there are particularly, historically, it was always international students from particular backgrounds or very different learning cultures that were susceptible to causing problems with academic integrity, or certain groups that perhaps caused issues in the past? Do you think it's a case of being able to offer more support and more alternatives in order to be able to steer students away from any academic integrity issues?
Look, we've actually taken very much an educative approach, because we believe that, yes, we do have a more significant occurrence in our international student cohort, but it really is about the support that we give in terms of making sure that they understand what academic integrity is and how to engage in academic practice that has, that is underpinned by integrity. So for us, it's been more educative, and we've really tried to reinforce that in terms of not only assessment, but also other activities that students engage in.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Ishan, can I bring you in, please? Just perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how Inspera's work supporting universities has changed in the past, in the recent era, and also what you think the sticking points, how they can be combated. So things like proctored assessment for digital exams that are not the most popular formats with students.
No, they're not. And I think that's right. And I think it's worth acknowledging. I joined Inspera just over a year ago. Prior to that, I spent 2.5 years at a university implementing it. Prior to that, I was an academic and a barrister before that. And the relevance of that is that I've spent time with the awarding bodies in the UK who have exactly the same approach, both in law and accountancy in particular, in insisting that exams remain proctored in some sort of format. What we've had to do over the last couple of years is pivot to offering that as a method of assessment, knowing that it's not wholly popular with academics, nor is it wholly popular with students. I think what's worth bearing in mind is that while it's not wholly popular, it's not wholly unpopular, in that there are some students and some academics who want to use it. And so my approach is we offer it as a flexible method of assessment, but I certainly wouldn't say that you should impose that on all of your students. The professional bodies, both in the United Kingdom and also in Australia and New Zealand, are going to take a number of years to get beyond the idea that their assessment should be closed book and proctored and invigilated in some sort of way. From a personal point of view, as a former lawyer, I still don't understand why lawyers around the world who spend their time with computers and with books in front of them insist on having closed book exams for the sort of knowledge that you wouldn't be expected to remember off the top of your head, and why they insist on people writing exams when you wouldn't write. I took the bar exams almost 20 years ago in the UK, and the only time I ever wrote an opinion was in that exam. Thereafter, I got my laptop out and typed it. So I think when it comes to things like proctoring, yes, as Sherman pointed out, we are some way away from actually getting others to accept that there is that great opportunity to assess in a different way. In the interim, then, there's an opportunity to say to students, here is some choice. If you want to be proctored, and let's be entirely open with you as to how this is going to work, what's going to be recorded, who's going to see it, and I'm very much a proponent of that being internal to a university rather than being elsewhere, that is an option for them that you might want to provide. You might not. And I think we're living in that slight flux at the moment where the issue of COVID gets in the way of thinking where we may go next. At the same time, when we think beyond that, outside of those accredited bodies, I think the greatest change that we've seen over the past couple of years is that what was seen as too difficult or things that we didn't want to do because they seemed a little tough, we've been forced to do. Now, there is a slight panic to that. I remember being at a university at the start of the pandemic in March last year and having to pivot all of those assessments away into something that was digital and online. But now that we've opened the Pandora's box and seen what's in there, there's a good opportunity to keep the good stuff that existed and perhaps jettison some of the things that we've had to do in an emergency, but not in this frame of that's what we must do and that's it. It's about saying, you know what, the toolkit has expanded and there's more that you can do. And importantly, you've seen that some of this works. I think it's also, as a sort of final point on this, given some of those academics who have wanted to try things but haven't had the opportunity, a chance to do so and almost prove that they work. But it remains a question of flexibility rather than saying we must just do this because that is it. Because if we look back at what may not have worked in the past, which was, I often say locking, and I totally don't mean that, but making students sit in a room and do an exam and saying that probably wasn't the only way of doing it. Going digital and putting somebody in front of a computer is not the only way of doing it too. So we should leave ourselves with all of those options that we can use. Okay,
thank you, Ashan. Bridget, what are your thoughts on this?
I was just going to pick up on the digital or remote invigilation. We were, as we were flip-flopping through alert levels and whether students were going to be allowed on campus or not, we had some exemptions for final year courses that were going to result in professional registration. So we gave, exemptions for those exams to be, conducted in person, invigilated, and had a whole raft of arrangements. And of course, then we went into lockdown further. So we course directors had the choice of having using smarter proctoring for those exams. So we had about 9,500 sort of individual assessment settings. So it was very interesting to see, how it, in fact it worked, and it was really for a deterrent. We didn't routinely look at all the capture, the screen capture, but we said to students if there were other flags that suggested that there was an academic misconduct incident, that the recording would be, reviewed as part of that tool. And it was interesting with students, we'd sort of had a lot of discussion about cheating, because in fact students themselves had raised concerns that they knew there were, when we first went into lockdown, that they felt there were large numbers of students cheating. They'd been invited to join in groups, collaborate on our exam type thing. So it was an interesting sort of U-shaped distribution of student opinion, those that felt, hey, I've studied really hard here and I feel like I'm being disadvantaged because there's people in my class who are electing to do well by other means. And then there are other students that were very supportive of sort of current practice. So it was a very interesting discussion. And I think where we landed, there's things we can learn about the smarter proctoring. It went pretty well. We requested that students did a mock sort of exam to get them into the system, familiar with the system. The issues that we did have were predominantly students that didn't take up that opportunity. So they were predominantly technology issues with the system rather than the proctoring themselves. But it seemed to serve that purpose for that very small, narrow group of courses which do result in professional registration. Of course, we had the challenge where Auckland, we couldn't have exams, but other parts of the country where students were doing those same sort of completing professional degrees were sitting an exam in an invigilated setting. So we were conscious that we needed to have some equivalency there.
It does seem like now there's a much more complicated balancing act between equity and personalisation in order for people to feel like they're getting the assessment that's fair to them. Giselle, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, kia ora, Alistair. Yeah, thanks. Just picking up from some comments that Bridget and others have made, and also noticing the comments in the chat, particularly around risks around Eurocentric thinking in terms of assessment. Here at my university at Massey, we have been heavy users over the last 2 years of invigilated exams, online proctored exams, and progressively moving towards digital modes of assessment. We're also very, very conscious of the ways in which we have to allow sufficient flex for our very diverse group of learners. We had a research team at my university who undertook a very extensive study of student attitudes and reflections on their own digital capability. And we found through that study that was completed at the end of last year that most students are actually really positive about online exams. They feel reasonably confident in their ability to complete an exam, and they had the necessary digital competencies to do so. But this really cleaves apart when you're looking at ethnic and cultural difference there, and it goes not just to the usual kind of digital inequity issues that we might point to, which is around access and so on, but it really highlights students' own perceptions of their digital capabilities and their confidence to undertake online exams. And I think that's an area that we've really got to think about in terms of how we build student confidence as well as competence, and ensure that in building a brave new world, we're not just doing that for what might be seen as a Eurocentric dominant paradigm, but to think about the wide variety of students who I think we all seek to serve and to support.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think one of the things that THE's reported on quite a lot during the course of the pandemic has been the issue of digital poverty. And this is not necessarily not having access to a laptop or a tablet, although those are huge problems for some students. It's also having the space to study, which when you decentralize education, robs a lot of people of the time and the environment and the infrastructure that they need. Jenny, you said right at the top of the hour that your university has obviously prided itself as being a campus and a destination. Is there thought now to how the activities on campus may change, and the idea that you can have digital assessment but may also need to accommodate that on campus?
No, look, absolutely. And I should say, I think it has to go back to your strategy of what you think you want to focus on. So we were looking at our strategy and decided, well, we need to make sure we can assess the student learning outcomes for that individual student and collectively. So we actually opted for majority face-to-face invigilated exams, and then we made a choice with everything else because we have large cohorts interstate, overseas. So we had invigilated online exams this year for two groups. One was the group where really there was no other option. They were stuck overseas or interstate, but the other group was those courses in which the professional bodies insisted on invigilation of some kind. So it goes back to Ishan's point. We didn't put the choice down to the student. We made that decision early on at the course coordinator level and said, look, you could have this as a face-to-face exam or an online exam, but if your course is historically one that needs to be invigilated because of external requirements, and we had this other category, historically has had high academic integrity issues, then we did actually feel a proctored online exam was the safest way to conduct that exam. And that was saying that, academic integrity is one of the kind of primary concerns that we wanted to protect. Now, our experience, like others, was actually very positive. So at the end of their proctored online exam, the students had the option of doing a survey. In semester 1, 40% did it. In semester 2, which we've just finished or almost finished, we're doing replacement exams right now, SUPs, 38% so far have filled it in. And 85% were positive about their individual proctor, because it was a proctored system with one proctor for about 8 students. And that was consistent across the year. And in semester 1, 70% were positive about the whole exam experience, and in semester 2, 74%. So those figures are actually very, I think, very satisfying to us, and actually goes back to the point that was made earlier. These students, especially school leavers or recent school leavers, are really pretty comfortable in an online environment. And in fact, we had far more anxiety from the students who were having to do face-to-face exams. I think the key to making this work is lots and lots of communication, no matter what the activity. And we are looking right now at the balance of what stays online. So our lectures will stay online. Pretty much everything else we're trying to bring back face-to-face, because we also think that going to university is a social experience. Now, you can have a social experience online, and my previous university was an online university, so I absolutely believe that too. But I think where you have these cohorts and you're trying to create a cohort experience, having an on-campus experience, if you're able to do that, it's important. And I particularly believe that for our international students, it's one of the great tragedies, I think, of the pandemic is that students have not been able to exercise that choice to travel and have an on-campus experience, and we will be the poorer for that. Just on that point, actually, we have residential colleges that are affiliated with my university, and I heard yesterday one of those colleges for the first time ever will have no international students next year. It's full with local students and no one able to come across borders. And another college told me that this is the first time since the 1950s that they will have very few students from Asia. And the reason why they've always had lots of students from Asia in that college is a legacy of what was the Colombo Plan. And in Australia, we have the new Colombo Plan now. But the purpose of that was to encourage cross-cultural, intercultural exchange. And without that, our societies are poorer.
Thank you, Jamie. Just to return slightly to the point of the on-campus experience and how that's changing for different institutions. Dominic, you said before when you talked about academic integrity, about how you take an educational approach to try and mitigate the risks of it. Is it now a case of taking an educational approach to what can be done on campus, so students who suffer from digital poverty are more aware of their options? And are you considering different activities on campus as a result of that?
As a result of the academic integrity, or as a result
of digital poverty, sorry.
So one of the things that we have identified is that some of the tools and technologies that we ask students to engage in through assessment tasks were quite, they were limiting for students to be completely active. You know, there was no whole of cohort, you know, equality sort of thing in the things that we were asking students to access and use for their assessments. So coming back on campus, we are trying to look at ways in which we can actually design our assessment tasks so they are a building process. So we're looking more at assessment as learning and assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. So it's this shift in thinking about how we assess our students and looking at some of our on-campus engaged activities, how we can include those as a part of the student's assessment task. It also enables us to, particularly with, you know, the group work, that's always been a real burden for our students and something that they tell us is just, you know, that they don't like it. And so in terms of our group tasks, when we bring students together and we have that social constructivist approach to their learning on campus, we're trying to embrace that shift and understand how we can turn that learning into, you know, the preemptor of assessment. And then the students will sort of reflect on what they've done in a group, and then that will be submitted as their individual component of the assessment. We've also been making some significant changes to our CMS to enable our staff to really think through what their assessment task is and how they're delivering it, whether it is an individual task or a group plus individual type task. That sort of thing's been a real driver for change as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominic. Sherman, can I ask you about how the well-being needs of staff and students are being factored into the changing approach you're taking to digital assessment?
Yeah, that's actually a really tricky question there, Alistair, because there's the context of right now where we know that staff and student wellbeing has just been through, you know, 22 months of a really tumultuous time. I know from speaking to our staff, they feel like it's been a really tough couple of years, and that quite frankly, they just need a break. They just need a chance to catch a breath, etc. So there's certainly been some work done at RMIT to try and address that. So you know, you mentioned, I think prior to the webinar going live, we're talking about the break over summer here, and we're certainly encouraging staff to take that time and take that break. We implemented what we call wellbeing leave and gave staff an extra 5 days of leave during the latter half of this year, just in acknowledgement of that reality that you know, there was certainly an increased impost due to the pandemic. For the students, we've also made some considerations around assessment. So we've done, and many universities have also done this, allowed the results not to count towards the GPA, for example, during this year, to relieve some of that tension and pressure that our students were certainly communicating to us that was affecting their well-being. I think the more interesting question is what happens next year? How does that transition to blended actually occur? We've got the added dimension of returning international students and constantly changing plans from federal and state governments around what is allowed and what's not allowed. We've got the additional layer of vaccination status and the sentiment of the staff and students around vaccination status. So it's actually quite a complex picture around how we support the staff and students into a different type of normal. As a principle, we put the health and well-being of our students and staff as the #1 priority. So all the decisions we'll make around, the return to campus, the activities we allow, vaccination status, et cetera, will be built around that principle of ensuring health and well-being of staff and students. But there will be many conversations over the next few months around what that looks like in detail. And how we ensure that support actually is operationalized. It doesn't probably answer your question directly, but it probably paints a picture of the complexity of the factors that we have to engage with.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I don't think we can expect any sort of any sort of short-term and easy answer to this, because as you say, it is ultimately trying to shape strategy for a multi-year period of change and adjustment. Dominic, can we come to you next, please, and then Bridget after that?
Sure. So I was just going to focus on two things that we've really tried to upskill staff in with respect to assessment and student wellbeing. And one is ensuring that our staff provide students with the support, mainly through information, clear information and details about the assessment task and how to complete the assessment task. Because one of the things we identified in early surveys with our students is that lack of understanding about what they are expected to do was a real springboard to wellbeing issues. The other thing is about feedback. We were very surprised, I guess, at how much the feedback that is provided to students has got a significant correlation to students' wellbeing. So in terms of our feedback, we were really trying to promote and get our staff to give students constructive feedback that is about the task. Not always, students were telling us things like, all my feedback's around my grammar or the way I've referenced. Whereas students really felt that they needed more information about what they needed to do or what they hadn't done correctly and how important that was for their subsequent assessments and engagement in the unit. So they're two things that we did focus on heavily, and we are continuing to focus on with staff and modernising our approach to assessment.
I see. So it forms a more natural feedback loop in terms of how you sort of revise the assessment going forward.
That's right, but also the feedback in terms of if this is going to be a foundation for a subsequent assessment task, make sure that the assessment feedback is formative and helps students to prepare or do better in the subsequent assessment tasks.
I see, thank you. Bridget, we can come to you next, and then Giselle after that, please.
Yes, just going to pick up on you've talked about the wellbeing needs of different kinds of students. I think the other risk area we see as a result of COVID and the disruption to schooling is the learner preparedness of our school leavers coming into our programs, because many of these students have had 2 years of disruption to their studies. They've had to study at home. They may not have necessarily done exams, etc. So really thinking about and a level of anxiety. We've had feedback from some of our from schools in our low decile areas about students' anxiety, just feeling not confident that they're prepared enough, in fact, to come to university because of this disruption to their studies. So we've been looking at ways to support those students. We already have some existing things in place, but also once they start their programs, how we can support them and be more proactive rather than reactive. So using data analytics from your learning management system to say, okay, what students have not submitted something on time or failed early on. We have an assessment very early on in the semester, and so that we can start to flag students that may need some additional support. So I think it's some of those activities are even more critical at this time than they normally are.
So that's laying additional groundwork in order to make sure that you stem attrition or underperformance and that type of thing.
So that we're setting them up for success really rather than failure, and having a better sense of what we need to do to meet their needs rather than what they need to do to meet our needs. So I think it's really that student-centric focus.
Okay, great. Thank you. Giselle, we come to you next, please.
Yeah, kia ora. I mean, that's a really important imperative, I think, for all of us in terms of understanding how we can minimise those barriers to success for our learners. And I think over many years, our institutions have probably given a bit of lip service to being student-centred and student-centric. And the student voice is becoming increasingly important in thinking about what we offer and how we offer it. I just wanted to add a note in here that at my university, Massey, we've been delivering a blended teaching and learning model for the last little while. We do that across 3 physical campuses. In pre-pandemic, pre-2020, more than half of our students studied in a fully online mode. And we're trying to roll out the blended approach in a way that we're not duplicating teaching so that we're not burning out our academics. And it's really interesting because I think even now, our stakeholders and indeed I think our government funders tend to see us as operating 2 separate businesses, on campus and online, when in fact we know that students will be engaging continuously in consuming their digital learning, whether or not they're on campus or they're off campus. So that's really important. I just want to go to something a little bit different, Alistair, if I may, and it speaks to the title of our discussion today about how digital assessment can help to revolutionise online and blended learning. I think there's a wonderful opportunity for us all to think about digital assessment, digital modes of delivery, to really enhance the equity, access and excellence agenda that I know many of us are committed to. But at the same time, we have to think about what are the impacts on our academics, and particularly in terms of their research momentum. I know we haven't really touched on that today. I'm very worried about the fact that many of our academics have been fully committed to teaching and redeveloping their curriculum over the last couple of years. What will this mean for the future of research in this part of the world? And I think also there are some challenges there for universities in regards to how we manage the future development of our campuses, the design. Do we still build lecture theatres? How much space do we put into traditional learning and teaching spaces and so on? And these are really going to be things that really cascade from that conversation around digital assessment. So I think there are a myriad of other issues that we could explore there, Alistair, that we probably won't have time to get into today, but I thought I'd just note a few that are top of mind for us here in Aotearoa.
No, thank you very much for noticing me. I don't think we've got about 13 minutes left, so I'd love to, but I think we should probably stick to what we've got on the docket. There's also, I think, a really interesting conversation to be had with Australian and New Zealand universities about the future of executive education and adult education, given that at a policy level, it's quite often held up as a bellwether globally as to how these things are going to start to take shape. But just to stay on course, Sherman, can we come to you next, please?
I'm not sure if we're going to keep us on course or not, Alice. I just wanted to pick up on that word revolutionise that Giselle quite rightly picked up on for the heading. And I think for me, what COVID and the pandemic have done is given us the opportunity to rethink what we've done historically. In some ways, it's a volume knob, an accelerator, however you want to do it, to really ensure that we think about the progressive thinking that many of us have done around assessment and other learning activities in the past, and given us the opportunity to, in some ways, make sure that we don't go back to bad habits that we've been doing just because we've always done them. So that's the opportunity. And it's really incumbent on us to think about, well, what is the purpose of, for the purposes of this discussion, what is the purpose of assessment? And Dominic mentioned, assessment as learning and for learning as well as of learning. And how do we actually think about assessment almost from first principles again? Given the opportunity that the digital aspect in one instance, but certainly the pandemic more broadly, has given us to actually have that conversation. I thought I'd just throw that one on the table.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the Q&A section in the 10 minutes that we've got left. But Ishan, I just had a couple of questions for you. Perhaps you can give us a perspective from the supplier side of things. Two things really. One is we've spoken a little bit about data analytics. So my first question would be, what are the most instructive data points that university partners have gathered in your experience? And the second one is partly related to one of the questions that we've had from the audience, which is, how can universities manage LMS integration better when they are undertaking digital assessment? And how do you address that at Inspera?
So I think in terms of the data points, what's interesting to think is that I don't think that necessarily a platform is going to give you a revolutionary new set of statistics. I think what it's going to do is let you collate some of the things that you were doing before in a quicker and smarter way. So I'm not going to sit here and say, hey, you know what, there's 5 new things that you can do. I don't think that's the case. It's the ability to do that a lot quicker. And that then frees up time for people to do the innovation that we've heard about, to think about the ways in which they could assess in a different way or perhaps a better way. So if you're spending less time on manual tasks, that's the first point. What you can then do is look at all of the sort of very smart statistics you can get out of questions that we've perhaps not had the time to do in the past. So I wouldn't run before we're trying to walk. Let's actually get the machines to do the things that they do well and don't get tired doing, and use that to integrate it with other data that we already have on our students. But just on this point of data, before I get to your second question, which is, I think if we're going to collect data on people, then we ought to share it. I know that I partly hate doing surveys because I think I'm never going to see the result of this. I'm never going to understand why I've done this. And I think students are in exactly the same space. If you say to them, look, we're going to take some data out of these exams, but we're going to share it with you in a way that makes sense to you and that helps you, not only A, are they happier that you're doing that, B, they're getting something out of it. So there's got to be something for all of us out of that data. In terms of the LMS integration, I think there's 2 ways of thinking about this. When I implemented Inspera at a university, I very deliberately didn't put it in the LMS. And like many decisions we make, it's probably slightly centered around what I was thinking, what others were thinking. When I think of assessment, I want to be in a very different headspace to where I'm being taught and where I'm learning. And so I wanted it to look different and be different. I wanted the environment to be different. And I wanted to feel like I was in an exam hall, much as I hate doing that. So yes, you can integrate it. Yes, there's the ability to integrate it with your LMS and have that easy path in for students. But I think it's also worth thinking that they may want to be in a different place and get themselves in a very different headspace for their assessments, because it ties in with some of the points that have already been made, which is student comfort. And I think that the way that we make students comfortable is by supplying them with as much information as we can and as many opportunities as they can to practice. Because we all know, if you're going to do an exam in an exam hall, you know all the steps. You wake up in the morning, you have a shower, you leave 3 trains earlier than you need to, you have your pens and pencils with you, you get to the place that you need to be, and you get yourself in the zone. Number 1, you may not be able to do that at home. You may not have the space to do that. I'm lucky enough that I have a second room that I can use to work in. Not everyone has that. So if you're going to do it in your bedroom, you have to actually physically not move, but get yourself in the right headspace. So let's give students that information, which is probably the easier bit, but let's also think about that environment in every shape and form that it might exist. The LMS integration is actually, if we think about it, a benefit to us. It makes our lives a little bit easier to be able to say, well, the student's in this module, so therefore I can get them into this exam. That's fine, but the student-centric bit that everyone has mentioned, because everyone is interested in that and making sure that that works, means actually thinking about all of those factors.
Great, thank you. I should clarify, sorry, I misunderstood the question from the audience slightly about LMSs. It wasn't so much about integration as whether LMSs have the tools necessary in order to design different approaches to assessment. So now for a platform such as Inspera, how much is the design element of different assessments critical to what you're trying to help universities with?
One of the things that we think that we do well is to have a really good student experience. Can you do everything in your LMS? Maybe. let's face it, Moodle, as an example, does MCQs, it can handle essays, and it may be enough for you. It may be what you need to do and what you need to use. The difference with using a platform is that there's often more question types in there. There is that difference in the environment. And there's also the load point, which is that if you've got everyone in your LMS both being taught and doing assessments, there is, from a almost quite a simple point of view, that when you're using your LMS to learn, you're not clicking on it all of the time. You're letting it provide information to you. When you're doing an exam, actually you're interacting with it quite a lot. So anyone here who's involved in the sort of back end of your LMS will know that the strain you place on it is quite huge when you're doing an exam. Every MCQ involves a click. The clicks make a difference in terms of how quick it works. So you may find that actually doesn't work for you. So is Inspera the kind of tool that you have to have? No, not necessarily. Your LMS may do it. You may have all the capacity you need. It may have all the questions that you need. But platforms are there for a reason, and that is to provide that really good assessment experience. Let's face it, if all you use your LMS for is to just put artifacts on there, which I'm sure nobody here is doing, you could just give your students Dropbox, but you don't. You give them an LMS because that's the right environment for them to be taught in, because it's customized for that. So yeah, I'm not here to say everyone needs to use Inspera at all, but I'm here to say, actually, it's a chance to look at what you need and what your institution needs to try and work out where the best place to put your assessments are.
Okay, thank you. I mean, to the point that you made about increasing automation for certain types and tasks for assessment, I wonder if I could ask the panel, does that link to something that should be considered when we've had another question about just avoiding staff burnout and how do you do it, basically? We've spoken a little bit about, Bridget made some points about how the onboarding and the training has been delivered for staff at Auckland. But when we look at automation, again, it's, being keen to avoid doing something just because you can do it. Does it create an avenue where you can perhaps reduce workload without sacrificing quality? And have any of the panelists had experience of that? Okay, a couple of hands have gone up there. Giselle, if you don't mind going first, and then Bridget after that, please.
Yeah, kia ora, Alistair. Yeah, I can speak to this, and I've seen there's a couple of comments and questions in the chat. So here at Massey, I mentioned that, we've been delivering distance and also pre-pandemic online for some time. What we have done, and we've used and leveraged the LMS to do this, is to ensure that we do not have two iterations or more than two iterations of a particular course. So in the past, we've had what we've called a distance offering, now an online offering, and an in-person offering. So you bring those together. I know it sounds really simplistic, but if you bring that together and you've got an entire cohort, an entire class, you are actually respecting the fact that students will engage with their learning, even if they are on campus, they'll engage in a digital mode as befits and suits them. But it means that there's more opportunity for a course coordinator and a lecturer to really streamline the engagement and understanding that they effectively have a single cohort. That's one of the ways that we have leveraged the LMS in terms of doing that. I do think, however, going back to a previous comment, that we shouldn't just confine ourselves to, I think, the functionality of the LMS. I think we talked earlier in the conversation around authentic assessment, and I think we've really got to push the boundaries a little bit there, because at the end of the day, we're not slaves to systems. The academic mission and purpose is number one at the university, and we need those systems and processes to fall in behind and support the academic mission. And I think, sometimes we're at a bit of a tipping point in our university. So Alistair, just a few comments there.
Sorry. Bridget, can you go next, please?
Look, just very quickly, because I can see we're nearly out of time, but one of the things that we've done to help reduce workload, for example, with the rollout of Inspera, we had Inspera champions in each faculty. So they had some buyout time to help staff with the rollout, help them create their assessment, change their assessment design. So that was really, really useful. And I think the other part that a lot of these things can, save staff some time. There's some great tools out there to help with feedback, feedback fruits, there's threads, there's all sorts of tools you can use that can help actually save staff some time, I think, to Ishan's point. So some of these technologies save time in some aspects to allow staff to be creative and think up different ways of assessment at other points.
And how much do you package trial and error into that process?
Well, I think that's the other point. Sharing and reflecting is key. That's what we should be doing as great teachers, reflecting on the things that worked, the things that didn't, and having showcases, things that can actually support that. Because I think, and evaluating, evidence of this worked because of these reasons, it failed because of these reasons, because that's, how we all learn and grow and share that knowledge amongst our peers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That pretty much takes up to time, I'm afraid. So I would like to thank our panel for joining us, Bridget, Giselle, Sherman, Jenny, Ishan, and Dominique. It's been really interesting to hear your insights and how things are being applied and rolled out in different institutions across the region. Everyone who's registered for this event will receive the full on-demand version of this webinar as a recording, which will be hosted on the THE website, along with a summary article of its key findings for those of you who would like to revisit or share this content. All that's left is for me to wrap up now. So we hope you've enjoyed this event. It's been great to have so many people in the room with us, and we look forward to seeing you at future THE events, I hope. So thank you, and until next time, goodbye.